That Dungeness crab is the most highly valued commercial fishery in California at this time, so that was my priority. My partner, Captain Cuccinelli, was here, and he said he had some great conversations with many of you in the audience. So I thought I'd throw up a little graphic there. What we might be issuing some of the beachgoers here in California at some point later as we move forward with the technological solutions. So one of the things that California has done is we've instituted, as you know, or implemented the MPA network, the Marine Protected Area Network. And California is a national and global leader in implementing that network and coming to grips with what it takes to manage that large of an area of marine protection. When I talk about marine protection, a lot of people automatically assume that it's a closure, a complete closure of all activity. And as we will find out later, that that's not at all what it means. And many of our marine protected areas are just areas of differential regulation. So, for instance, California's jurisdiction extends out to 3 miles. As part of our agreement, our joint enforcement agreement with NOAA, we can extend our presence out to 200 miles. But beyond that, there are no other regulations. So we have new regulations at 200, new regulations at 3, and various patchwork of other regulatory schemes within various areas within that huge patchwork. So it's very complex, and as I'll throw up a graphic a little bit later, very few, if any, are exclusion zones. So when we look at things, we want to keep that in mind, that just because a vessel's in there doesn't mean they're violating. So I'm going to throw up this next, and I'm going to warn you, there's some audience participation in this, so you have to pay attention. So on this one, can anybody tell me what violations they might see? Yes, ma'am.
Dumping. There's
Dumping.
Water, brown, black water maybe, or some water.
Okay, great. How about
ID numbers displayed?
no ID numbers? Okay. So in various parts of the code, the ID numbers may be different. My point on this one is you really can't tell. This is a great image. It's an image that is probably superior than any electronic method that you have out there, whether it's a UAV or any other thing. Just because we see this picture and you send it to us as an enforcement agency doesn't mean we're taking this one to court, right? So how about if I told you that this was in California, this picture was taken in a state marine conservation area? Would that make any difference for any of you?
Yeah.
What would that difference be? Anybody? No fishing? Well, remember we said that so we have various designations within our jurisdiction. A state marine reserve, for instance, has no commercial or sport fishing, right? So let me say it, and a state marine conservation area may have differential regs. So we may be able to take a certain type of species aboard that vessel. Let's say that you saw that picture in the state marine reserve, where you know there's no commercial fishing and no sport fishing. Could you safely take that to court and say that's a violation?
No. There's no real evidence that we see out there.
Right, thank you very much. So I don't have any candy to pass out, but if I did, so bottom line is, what do we need to make that closure? And we're talking about enforcement here. In some of the presentations that you heard earlier, they talked about compliance. Compliance and enforcement are different, right? Compliance can be achieved by a variety of methods. One great method is education and outreach. That's a great method to achieve compliance. However, at the end of the day, when we take an enforcement action, and I know I have a couple lawyers in the room, what's my standard for a criminal case? Beyond a reasonable doubt. So if I take this picture to court and say this was seen in a state marine reserve, can I say beyond a reasonable doubt that these guys are in violation?
No.
So that's a pretty good image. As we move further away from an image like that, and we look at positional data, things that we saw earlier, well, these guys might be fishing. We heard that a couple times. They may be fishing. They're doing actions consistent with fishing. What we really need at the end of the day to complete that enforcement loop is boots on the deck. And in fact, educated boots on the deck. So we need officers from whatever jurisdiction you're in to understand the nuances and the regulations of fishery law, of fisheries technique, and be able to differentiate whether they are retaining or taking a legal species or not. And you might think, well, that's easy, right? But a lot of boardings are conducted, and I don't want to throw my Coast Guard brethren under the bus, but a lot of boardings are conducted when a fisheries violation is not detected. And that happens with us too. Anecdotal evidence, just the other day we had 3 wardens, fish and game wardens, or sorry, Fish and Wildlife, we've changed our name. Fish and Wildlife officers board a boat, and 2 officers gave them the green light, and the 3rd officer kind of didn't quite have that same feeling, and they ended up finding a bunch of abalone illegally taken on the boat. So we need boots on the deck and educated boots on the deck to close that enforcement chain of events. And again, I'm talking from the pointy end of the stick. If we can get compliance any other way, we ought to do that. And we ought to use technology for deterrence, for education and outreach. But at the end of the day, if we have people that want to violate, we have to be able to take them to court and win that. So we can institute sanctions, penalties to deter that further activity. So I talked a little bit about exclusion zones, and I apologize for the graphic here, although I think my graphic's a little bit clearer than some of the other ones. There's a tiny print. I was sitting in the back. So here's a snapshot of what our coastline looks like right off the coast here. So that's San Francisco Bay down in the lower right-hand corner. And you'll see there's a patchwork of marine protected areas. And each one of those marine protected areas have state marine conservation areas that have some activity allowed in them. State marine reserves, which I mentioned, only have certain, or they have no commercial or recreational fishing activity allowed within them. And all these areas have a patchwork of regulations. There are only 2 very, very small segments in there. And I don't know if you can make it out, but it talks about the Point Reyes Headland Special Closure, and these other 2, Point Resistance Rock Special Closure and Double Point Stormy Stack Rock Special Closure. If you look at the relative size of those are the only 3 areas represented on this entire patch of coastline that are exclusion zones. So now it's pretty easy. If a vessel's in there, they're in violation. That's the easiest job for me. However, you can see that we have a lot of areas that don't have that same condition. And so vessels can be in there, they can be in there doing various activities, which makes my job and the job of detecting a violation that much harder, especially when we talk about only having snippets of information, a visual image, positional data, things like that. So here's the type of positional information that I can get, and Paul, you see I've scrubbed the data that's pertinent. So this is a single vessel. This is what the NOAA technicians look like, what us as enforcement officers look like. This is available to us in a real-time situation, aboard a laptop, whatever. This is a particular vessel off the coastline. You can see this is from VMS data. It shows positional data. That positional data comes over the network at 1 ping per hour. That's all we get at this point. That's all that's mandated, and I'll talk a little bit about that on a later slide. But that's the type of information we can get. That yellow band in there is in fact a marine protected area. It's called the Rockfish Conservation Area. It happens off the coast of California. It has differential regulations, and there are certain fishery participants that are prohibited from being in that particular area. So that's what we've got to work with. Here's a little bit drilled down into that data, and you can see the trawl RCA, or the trawl rockfish conservation area, and we have this positional data and timestamp data, speed data available for that vessel. Again, that ping rate is once per hour, and that has proven to be somewhat problematic for enforcement. So there's recent case law, and we'll talk about how these all fit together, but there's recent case law that determined that that technology, in some cases, was not adequate to pin down what the activity was. So this is pretty fine-scale data. If you look at some of the data shots we saw earlier with some of the other systems, they're going to present similar data trends to you. So determining what that vessel did, just based on this alone, and taking that to court is problematic. It can be done, but it's problematic, and it has to not only rely on the technology, but it has to rely on some other factors as well. So just wanted to point that out. That's the kind of data that we're getting now, and again, it's been proven, or it's been challenged. So we talked about visual imagery, and I know a lot of technologies are, UAVs, high-speed cameras. We use them. We have really nice cameras in some of our aircraft. The Coast Guard, I know, has even better cameras in their aircraft. So we look at visual technology. The first shot we saw, everyone agreed that that boat looked like it was fishing, right? On the first audience participation. Yes. Right? So what do you think about this vessel? Any ideas on what it might be doing?
Again, there's not really a clear indication, but if it's like geotagged, we could probably figure out if it's in some sort of restricted area, and for observation, possibly say video or other imagery, you could figure out more about what they're doing.
Okay, so what you have to do is this guy's in a state marine reserve right now. No fishing, nothing. We'll get back to this picture later. But I just want to, these are the types of images that we're going to be able to capture. That first image was pretty good. This image is going to be pretty good too in terms of the technologies that we have available to gather data right now. So let's say that I did get an early warning system from my VMS track or my AIS track that a vessel was in a particular area. I send out my imagery, my drone, whatever it is, and I capture that image. Again, what am I taking to court? Those are the things that we need to understand as a way to further our technology and the sorts of information that we can use to achieve compliance and do enforcement action. Keep this picture in mind. How about this picture? That's pretty clear cut right there, right? So this one I'm pretty safe to say, but even then, let's say that this guy, when we go to court, he says, well, yeah, I had my gear out, but I was just washing my net. Exactly. So when I go to court, those are the types of defenses that I have to combat. So if this is in an area where this type of fishery is prohibited, and I am able to respond to that as boots on the deck, I get on the boat, I determine that not only is there fish within the net, but there's fish within the hold, and now we start to build the totality of the circumstances that I can be comfortable with going to court and say that this guy was fishing in a closed area, or he has illegal species, or any of those items. So here's where we try to bring everything together. See, I put you guys up there, right? Coast Guard. This is Coast Guard cutter Zephyr, I believe. It's they borrowed it from the Navy. It's a really cool boat, 189-footer. They did some fisheries patrol off of San Francisco Bay here, and I was able to join them for a few days. So it was a great platform and a great bunch of guys to work with. So bottom line is, the technology that we employ has to come with some sort of response. So if the technology aids in our response, and whatever that may be, boots on the deck, gathering more information, adding to a piece of the puzzle that we can derive more information from another source, that needs to work in conjunction. And then the next important piece of this is it needs to work in conjunction with, some of you have said policy. We'll take it a step further and go regulation. It has to have adequate law basis in the law. So for instance, the VMS track, one of the things that NOAA has done is create a regulation that mandates that a vessel must continuous transit through these closed areas. That's a very strong regulatory companion to the technology, right? So we have the VMS, and some people talked about AIS, VMS. I really don't care. Accurate positional data is what we're after. Accurate positional data with the fact that they can't turn it off. It must be carried on the vessel. Neither of those things exist right now. In the US, in California, in very small segments of particular fisheries, we have those companion regulations that mandate technology on the boat. Without that, it's volunteer. And of course, you're going to get some compliance, but those are the people that are going to comply anyway. So what we're after is the folks that are engaging in one of those buzzwords, the IUU fishing. And unfortunately, here in the U.S. and in California in particular, we drop off one of those U's. There's nothing that's unregulated in California. So we have illegal or unreported. So anyway, these three things are critical in working together. And that's what I would stress is as you develop your technology, think about ways to defeat it. Think about ways that you could craft language for regulators to not only implement your technology, but make sure your technology is functioning in the way you intend it to function. Speaking of technology working right, here's a picture of just one or two violations, serious violations in some of these marine protected areas can really affect the management of that marine protected area. And you can see those, for those of you that don't know, there's a bunch of Pacific spiny lobster sitting on the ground there with a very unhappy gentleman and one of our officers next to him writing a paper ticket, which is another area of technology that we can use some help with. So anyway, I listed some things here, and you'll see some common themes. And I'm really happy to be up here and listen to some of the other areas of concern and some of the other ideas that are coming about, because they play right into what we care about as enforcement officers. So RMS, what does that stand for? Our Records Management System. We talked to, believe Anthony, right? Talked earlier about information sharing. Right now, we don't have any way to share within our own agency, let alone various agencies. So that needs to be a bit better even here in California. So if a fish and wildlife officer contacts someone and issues a violation down in San Diego, the coastwide nature of many of our fisheries might put that fisherman in Oregon or Northern California the next week, and we don't really have a good handle on what he's doing or what his previous contact was about. So all the things that go into tracking what our contacts do and the people that we encounter. The other thing is, as many of you in this room, you guys are funding sources, and what are you getting for your money? How many boat hours are you putting on your boat? How many people are you contacting for that money? So all those things go into an adequate records management system that can be shared, or at least components that can be shared among enforcement agencies, among management entities, to further inform what's going on and trend analysis to be more efficient. And then VMS, we've heard AIS, VMS. Like I said, I don't have a preference. All I want to know is an accurate, defendable in court, positional information at a scale that I can use. A finer scale is better. We have systems out there that can take continuous transit, 2-minute, 1-minute intervals. Anything that gives me a finer scale of positional data is a bonus for us, either as an early warning system or as a component of my case package in the totality of the circumstances that I'm using to define the violation. And then seafood traceability, we heard a little bit about that in an earlier presentation. California's got a great system of seafood traceability. Whether it comes in by boat from the fishermen or it comes in by truck or anything else, we have a pretty good record of that in theory. Compliance is low. So we need a better way to ensure compliance and better enforcement. If I walk into a business in San Francisco and I see fish, they need to have the paperwork or whatever other record to go with that. And that's a very important part of this piece. Another important part of the piece we heard earlier was the international component. And I certainly, we've heard a lot about global fisheries enforcement. That hits home right here in California. When I walk into a business in San Francisco and I pull a case off of a freezer shelf that says South African green-lipped abalone on it, I want to know that that's a legitimate project or a legitimate product. I can't do that right now. But we just had a recent collaboration with the Interpol folks, the state of California, and everybody globally that deals in abalone products. And I pick abalone because it's a high-value, low-volume product. And those are the things that we can easily pick out and tease out as something that we can target. It was a very good operation. If nothing else, it shared informational data. So now I can take that same case of South African green-lip abalone, take a picture on my phone and email it to my counterpart in South Africa and get a real-time sense of the legitimacy of that product, that company, that shipment. So still a lot of things to get by, but that's an important component of what we do. And then the last one, I saw Mr. Filter in the audience. Thanks, Gail, for coming on in. The crowdsource thing. We talked a little bit about crowdsourcing, and we heard some stuff, and getting people engaged in the process is really important. Does anybody know, besides, I hope this, the first acronym there, TWIT? Does anybody know what that is? How many people, and again, more audience participation, how many people today drove in and saw somebody texting on their phone while they were driving? Anybody? Well, how about within the last week? Right? Everybody, right? So, yeah, compliance is pretty darn low on that. So there was a guy in San Francisco here, he said, hey, you know what? That bothers me as well. And so he instituted, and you could go to the website, and it's basically encouraging people to take pictures of people texting while in traffic. And he posts them up on a website. So he says, oh, here's Joe. So hopefully none of you are on that website. But so he says, hey, here's Joe, and look at him, he's texting, right? And it's not going to be really used for any enforcement purpose, really. I mean, it could be stretched into that, but very thin, and the CHP have a lot more to do than track down that. But I think the concept is really valid for us. And so, people are upset about it, and once we get community buy-off about environmental issues and everything, people become upset and they say, hey, Fish and Wildlife, why aren't you going out there and writing a ticket? Well, I can't be everywhere, and my officers can't be everywhere. Well, what you can do is take a picture of that activity. Now, it might not go anywhere, but it might. It might be part of a bigger investigation along with VMS, a visual image. All those things come together, and I might be able to take that to court. Or you could just serve as a deterrence. I don't want to get on that website. Or they say, hey, I know Joe. Joe's always down there poaching, and then we can finally get him. So my acronym is POP, or Pictures of Poachers. If one of you guys want to come up with a website, I can't promise we will look at it, but I can certainly promise we'll be there. So anyway, it's just some stuff to kind of throw out there. So here's a clue. We talked about visual imaging. And the boat in the MPA, or the boat in the Marine Protected Area, the boat in the State Marine Reserve. Here's a picture of what's inside that boat. So for those of you that don't know, those are red abalone. And this vessel was intercepted just a few years ago on its way down to Mexico from California to sell those. And unfortunately, that load right there economically is worth about $30,000. And that's what the guy was telling us. So. And that's one of our clues. If you open up the hold and you see that, we know we have a case.
For those who don't know, there is no legal commercial fishery for abalone in the state of California.
Correct. Yeah. For wild-caught abalone, there are aquaculture sources. These are not aquaculture, no. So, anyway, that's a close-up of the boat. You saw it earlier. So you couldn't determine what it was doing, right? So that's me. That's one of our patrol boats. So anyway, that's my contact information. Hopefully, I've spurred some thought, and hopefully someone will contact me and say, hey, Bob, we've got this great technology we'd love for you to try out. We'd like to talk about it. And that's why I'm here. And I really want to push the technological solutions forward with the caveat that that's not all what it seems. Questions?
Car and you go too fast, there's lots of cameras take the picture, you get a ticket.
Right.
Talks about that taking pictures. Do you see a time when boots on deck will not be necessary to get a conviction?
I think in certain cases, absolutely. And my camera report actually said, hey, well, they think it's like a red light camera, right? And so there's certain aspects of certain fisheries that could accommodate that. But I think you're never going to get away from boots on the deck in many of the cases. So we only need to prove a certain amount of items to write that ticket for a red light camera. And even then, here in the US, if you get a red light ticket, pretty much you go to court, they're going to dismiss it, which is another problem that is for another half-hour presentation. Yeah. So, but anyway, I think you know, we need not only boots on the deck, but also educated boots on the deck. And also, let me talk about that as well, as many of our officers could use technological solutions to assist them while they're on deck as well. So one of the big pushes nationally is electronic monitoring of vessels completely, right? Anywhere from duct taping a camcorder to the mast to an entire suite of electronic monitoring. One of the major issues with that is speciating what might go over the side or what might come across the deck. And our officers face that as well. There's lots of different species of rockfish and flatfish, and if we had a technological aid to assist us in identifying those species, I know the Coast Guard would love it. You wouldn't have to carry around your fish ID books, and neither would my officers. So think about that when we're looking at different technologies that might be applicable to what we do. Sir?
Given the area that you have to cover and your resources, how much latitude do you get in using technical solutions that are inadequate for enforcement at a probable cause to do things like board the boat and look with your own eyes?
Great concept, and that's exactly where I was going with the technology. If we can use the technology as an early warning system to not only target our enforcement efforts, make them more efficient, whether through trend analysis or an actual violation in progress, I think that's the biggest bang for our buck. Probable cause, if you're on the water, we'll board you. So that, you know, we don't need that. Gail.
So, question I have for you, there's been a lot of discussion yesterday and today about penetrating the markets. And I'm kind of interested in how would you develop that? Do you have to be boots on the deck as you see it with direct evidence, or can a strong case be made circumstantially?
And can you clarify penetrating the market? What do you mean by that?
Well, in other words, going after the guy who's accepting the contraband.
Right, yeah.
The middleman.
So the seafood traceability piece, that's why it's so important, is when we go into a market and I establish that that particular product came from an illegal source, being able to backtrack. And backtracking might include VMS data, might include visual data, and so we certainly, that's how we make our cases. The last big shark fin case that we just made here in California was derived from us entering a restaurant, determining that a portion of that product contained in that restaurant was illegal, and tracking it back to the source.
One last question on it, just as a follow-up. So, does the California Department of Fish and Wildlife engage in sting operations in order to...
Funny you should say that, Gail. Part of my job, my job, and I forgot to mention it because it's not really relevant, is I'm in charge of marine enforcement policy for the entire state of California. So I'm the point guy for marine enforcement. But as part of that, I'm also in charge of our covert team. So I have 10 or more undercover officers who routinely work cases in a covert nature.
I would be very interested in hearing your perspective on illegal night fishing, because it was recently brought to my attention that most violators of these fishing areas tend to operate at night, where it's harder to detect them and to apprehend them. Could you give us your perspective on that?
Absolutely. In fact, this just came up at the Dungeness Craft Task Force meeting. Unfortunately, and this is where we talked about technology and the regulatory process working together, right? So if I have a fishery opener at midnight, what do you think that does to my enforcement effort? So it's a bad deal. So we try to, if you look in California, in most cases, when does the fishery open? Well, it opens at midnight on such and such a date.